Welcome back to the archive. Today we're going to be covering my round 1 game from the October Skirmish, played in Atlanta recently. My round 1 game, I was playing someone I had seen at tournaments before, but never been paired against. And we're pretty equal in rating, so it was looking to be a good game. Started with a French defense, and I played knight to c3, inviting the win hour, also inviting the classical. And my opponent played knight f6, the classical variation. Traditionally, this has been a variation I've avoided playing against. I've had a lot of trouble with it, especially in tournament games. So I was a bit concerned about playing into it with e5 and right into the main line. However, the week before, I had done some review and learning about some of the ideas and trying to get more comfortable with it. So it just so happened that I was the best prepared I've ever been to go into it. Traditionally in the past, I've exchanged this pawn or even tried out the McCutcheon with bishop to g5, neither with a lot of success. So it was time to try out the main line. This pushes the knight back, but the knight is able to support c5, and black's going to get a lot of counterplay on the queen side pretty quickly. And white traditionally follows up with the move f4, supporting this e5 pawn and taking good control over the center and the king side. However, this does expose our king a little bit. Traditionally, I've avoided this move because I don't like playing f4 in general. I like to keep my king at least a little bit safe whenever he's on that e1 square. But in this position, there are a couple of things that tell us it's okay to expose the king with f4. First, if the queen ever does come to h4, we can simply block with pawn g3. And what I like to tell students is that if your check can be blocked by a pawn, it's probably not a good check. Of course, there are exceptions, but here is a perfect example. The queen would move to h4, the pawn would block, and the queen would have to move again, probably right back where it came from. The other thing that tells us that f4 is okay is that bishop c5 is impossible. When we play f4, we weaken the dark squares, but without the bishop being able to come to c5, it's very hard for black to take advantage of those dark squares. So it's safe to play f4. We just have to be wary in the long run that those dark squares are going to remain weak. And if we don't play it accurately, or if black can stir up some counterplay, they might be able to attack those weak dark squares. So black immediately plays the c5 pawn break, undermining our d4 pawn and trying to open up those dark squares. And we're going to fast forward a couple moves, just basic opening moves here of the main line. Fighting over the d4 square, which is the main fight in the French. And we reach this position right here, where black voluntarily trades the knights and plays b5. And so you can see that black is expanding on the queen side and looking to get their bishop to b7. This is normally black's bad bishop. In the French, it can be really bad because it's hard to get that bishop out. But here they're going to play it on b7, and since I don't have a d-pawn, they're going to look to push the d-pawn and open up that long diagonal, something for us to watch in the long term. I took a little bit of time here, and I realized that with the right series of moves, I could reach a position that was very near identical to one I had looked at the week before. And because I remembered that position from the week before, I could remember some of the ideas from that position, and I figured that would be pretty comfortable to play. Usually, you want to leave the tension between pieces or pawns and let your opponent break the tension. But here, I captured on c5, and when black recaptured, I played b4. And the knight doesn't have a good square. And we reach this position right here, where white is ahead in development. We've got a great bishop sitting on d3, and we're supporting the f5 pawn break later on. And black's counterplay on the queen side, at least for the moment, is not very dangerous. There are some ideas of the knight getting to c4 or piling up on the c file, but that's all going to take some time to prepare. So I thought this was a very pleasant position for white. And the computer agrees white does have a advantage at this point in the game. To be specific, if I flip on the switch, we're looking at half to 3/4 of a pawn. So, of course, not winning or anything like that, but enough that white should be happy, white should be pressing. So he plays bishop b7 as expected, and I go ahead and castle, and then play the prophylactic move king h1 just to get off those dark squares. I don't want to run into queen b6 check when I'm not ready for it. And my opponent plays queen c7, piling up on the knight. And now we've got the decision of what to do with the knight. Finding the next move for the knight is not the challenge. The real challenge is, where is this knight going to end up in the long term? So take a moment here. You can pause the video if you'd like. What would your plan be for our c3 knight that's under attack twice? If you decided that you were going to move the knight to e2, you're definitely on the right track. Knight to e2 is our next move. But where's the knight going next? If you were thinking about going to the g3 square, I like your idea. You're supporting f5. You're trying to play on the king side. But much stronger is the knight going to d4. Not only does it continue to support the f5 square, but it blockades the d pawn, so that black can't open that diagonal. And of course, the knight on d4 is much more central than the knight on g3. Knight b6, and knight to d4. And this allows black to jump in with their knight, as expected, and now white has a big decision. So one of black's ideas in this position is to play the move knight to b2, and try and go after this bishop. If white doesn't want to allow that, they can play queen to c1. But I didn't like that move because the queen is very passive on that square. It's only playing defense, and that's not the type of game or what this position calls for that I wanted. So queen c1, not a strong consideration. The big decision is queen to e2 or queen to f2. And I'll start by saying that both the moves are good. Queen to f2, if the bishop becomes under attack, we do have the option of saving the bishop with bishop to e2 and continuing with our kingside play. However, I decided on the move queen to e2, allowing my bishop to get trapped. I didn't think black could get away with playing knight b2 and chasing the bishop. If we remember, this knight has made a lot of moves so far. In fact, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now 7 moves with the same knight. And black's not castled yet. So that should be a red flag. Alarm bell should be going off. There should be something here. Black shouldn't be able to move that knight 7 times with their king in the center and get away with it. So in this position, white has some tempting options. So I would suggest again that you pause the video and take a look at this position. What would you play as white? Okay, so this position is winning for white. It is decisive. Now, I chose the wrong move. Still a good move, but not the decisive move. The most decisive move here is the move f5. With our queen on e2, we were still supporting that e5 pawn. And just a sample line of what could happen. Castle, exchange on e6. And we get a fork on e6 at the end with a very decisive position for white. So just breaking it open with the black king in the center, most straightforward path. And I did briefly look at this move, but I kind of got enamored with another idea, which was bishop takes b5. And while this idea was not quite as good as I thought it was during the game, the computer found some nice defensive resources for black. This was still a very surprising move for my opponent to face, and it doesn't give away white's advantage. It's just not quite as large as it would be with f5. So in this position, obviously if black does not take the bishop and they just move their king or block, then white has to be happy, right? We grab the pawn, their king either moved or we're going to be capturing something. And so they basically have to recapture. And the key here is we don't want to recapture with the queen, because then black can block with their queen, and we don't want to trade because we'd be down the piece we just sacrificed. Instead, we want to take with the knight. And this is the key position, the idea that the queen is under attack, and our knight is also going to be jumping into the d6 square to disrupt their king. In this position, the computer says that black is okay. White still has an advantage, but it's not a decisive advantage if they play the move queen to c2, which I considered during the game. I just didn't think it was that good for black. Knight to d6, king to d7, queen to h5, and in this position, I would have been happy with this in the game. And it says that it is even maybe an advantage for white. This is what I was planning on playing. Here, the computer wants white to play queen to e1 to keep the advantage and then get on the dark squares, I guess. But in any case, I would not want to play black in this position, even if it's even. Even if black has a slight edge. Very difficult position with the king stuck in the center. So, my opponent did not capture on c1. They instead played the move queen to c6, which I thought was a very logical move. The idea being to line up the queen and bishop on this diagonal, and if white isn't prepared, to play d4 and threaten some checkmates on g2, which at the very least will slow down white's attack. So, as I mentioned before, we need to watch that long diagonal. I'm going to need to keep an eye on that the rest of the game so that black doesn't get to turn the tables with a good d4 move. So I jump the knight in initially, the king comes up, and here, lots of good moves for white. We can play f5, we can play b5. I went ahead with the move queen to h5, just attacking this square right away. Black's best response would be g6. White still has an edge, but not decisive. And probably would have played queen to g5 or queen to h4. I hadn't decided yet. When I've talked or gone over this game with other people and students, talking about some of the ideas, I've gotten some questions about why didn't I take the rook? Or why didn't I take the bishop? So a couple of reasons. Because some of you are probably thinking, wait, you just had a fork. You should just go ahead and grab that material. Well, one, I sacrificed a piece to get this position. So if my goal is just to get my material back, I shouldn't have sacrificed. If your goal is to get the material back, then don't sacrifice in the first place. Right? You've got to get more than your material back, or there's no reason to sacrifice. In this case, if we do take the material back by capturing the rook, it is an even position. But this knight is better than the rook right now. It's on an outpost. Black has trouble dislodging that knight and getting it off that square, and it's really attacking a lot of squares in black's side of the board. So I definitely want to keep that knight if possible. I don't want to take the bishop because then I'm down material. Now, if I could capture the rook and bishop and trade queens, maybe my queenside pawns that are connected passed pawns can run down the board, but that's pretty far in the future. And I can always cash in by trading off this knight for one of these pieces later in the game in most cases. So there's no rush to do that. So don't be in a hurry to grab that material back. Now, if you lost the original piece, not sacrificed, but lost it, then maybe grabbing the material makes more sense, right? Get it back to an even game. But here, we purposely gave up the bishop, so we don't want to go ahead and give that material back. All right, so queen to h5. They go ahead and defend. We check the king. And now f5. f5's been a good move every move since I played bishop takes b5. just a strong idea in the position. And here, the threat is to capture on e6 and then capture on g7 with check. So my opponent plays g6, so that g7 is never hanging with check. Capture, capture, and this is our next position. So we are still down the piece, although we do have a couple pawns for it, and we've got to decide how to proceed. Go ahead and take a moment. What would you play as white in this position to really end the game? All right, if you were thinking, I'm going to go ahead and take the rook on f8, not a bad move, but strategically not a good idea. Right now when the rooks are facing each other, if we initiate that trade, if we release the tension, then black is going to go ahead and recapture, and they're going to have the f-file. Now in this position, we can probably get away with it, but in the long run, it's just not a good habit to be giving up the file like that. Some of you may have been thinking, rook captures f8, queen to h6, which is a good position, but much stronger is the immediate queen h6. And now we've got threats of capture on f8, or using f7, or using g7. And black's kind of forced to exchange rooks themselves, and now we see the inverse of the position, where we have the file, and their rook remains inactive, rather than they have the file and our rook remains inactive. So even in a position where you're on the attack and the focus is on a different area of the board, you want to keep in mind who controls the files. Because as long as you can control the file, if you're on the attack, it's going to be very helpful. And if you're on the defense, it's really going to slow down their attack. Now, in this position, I was wondering if my opponent would throw in the move d4, or even in our previous position, throw in the move d4, threaten mate. But in any case, it's very easy for me to stop the checkmate, and when I do, I don't really lose any of my attack. So my opponent makes the best decision here, which is to capture the knight, give up the queen, and try to play two pieces for the queen. It doesn't work. Simply recapturing the queen here is decisive. We're going to be able to play queen g7, attack the rook, attack the knight, attack the bishop, which should be decisive pretty quickly. I've played the move rook to f7 in this position, seeing a different tactic and still winning. King to e8, taking the queen. The king has to stay attached to the rook, and they can't stop our pawn. And so here, while we're technically down in material, they cannot stop us from queening the pawn, and we can capture any of these pieces basically whenever we want. So this was the final position where my opponent resigned. So I think overall I was very happy with the game because I was able to play an opening I didn't normally play and use some ideas that I had recently learned and convert an attacking position, sacrificing a piece and using that initiative for the remainder of the game. A couple of things I wasn't super happy with. I just should have looked at f5 more. It was a decisive move, and I kind of got enamored with bishop takes b5. Didn't consider enough alternative moves. I knew my position was good, so I should have taken the time to consider more options. Whenever your position is not good and you find one move that might be okay, all right, you play it, your position improves or your position stays the same. But when you've got a good position, you should really look for the best move, not just a good move. When you find a good move, look for a better move. And I really didn't do that in this game. Each time I thought I found a good move, I kind of went ahead and proceeded forward with that idea. My opponent did put up some good defense, though, so I was glad that I was able to attack accurately. And it was a good start to the tournament. All right, thanks for watching. Good luck in your games and your studies, and I will see you guys next time for round 2 from this event.